Okay, this afternoon we come to the mothership, Romans 1. Okay? And we're actually going to spend all afternoon, we're going to spend both sessions this afternoon on Romans 1. And so just to break it up, we're going to devote the first session to everything up to contrary to nature. Okay? So we're going to talk about impurity, about lust and passion, and about honor and shame as they're reflected in Romans 1 and how to interpret these in the larger context of biblical interpretation generally. And that will be our first round. And then we'll take a break and come back and do contrary to nature, and I'll move to some more general observations. So there may be some times in our first discussion where I say I'll get to that, just so you're aware kind of what the overall flow of things is. And then I'll end the second session with a little discussion about the vice list in 1 Corinthians 6 and 1 Timothy 1, and how those impinge on interpretation as well. So that's the plan for the afternoon. So let's dive into Romans 1. Romans 1 is obviously central to this debate. It is the New Testament passage that addresses the issue of same-sex relationships in far more detail than anything else does. It's also the only experience in the entire Bible that might at least speak to the sexual experience of women with women. Apart from this, we got nothing in the whole Bible about lesbian sexuality. Even though it should be noted, for the first 300 years of the church's life, it wasn't interpreted as lesbian sex at all, right? It was non-natural, probably non-coital sex between women and men, and I'll say a little bit more about that a bit later. But this passage also speaks about male sex explicitly as a particularly egregious and obvious and self-evident example of Gentile sinfulness. All right? And it's particularly that sort of rhetoric that gets you this first question that probably some of you have encountered as you talk with people about this issue is, why are you even talking about this, right? Isn't the Bible absolutely clear about this, right? And it really has to do with how we interpret the text. So the critical question that I want us to focus on is a simple one. It's the same one that I've been encouraging you to ask about before, and that is why? Why are the behaviors that Paul describes in this passage such acute examples of Gentile sinfulness? Then to what extent does that seem to apply to committed gay and lesbian relationships today? I mean, that's the basic structure overall. And my strategy in this is not, well, let's figure out a way that we can sort of avoid engaging this. My strategy is, let's look at it more closely. Let's take the language of Romans 1 more seriously and interpret it more carefully and pay more attention to what Paul actually does say rather than what we simply assume he's talking about. Okay? So that's the overall strategy. I want to just first of all introduce all four of these forms of moral logic that I think are part of the text. The first one is impurity, right? And that's, we talked about this whole area to some extent when we were talking about the Levitical materials, but there's a whole set of issues around what does impurity mean, particularly in a New Testament context where Peter has the vision that says what God has cleansed you must not call unclean, right? So the New Testament is doing some stuff with impurity, so we need to figure out what's going on there on that count. And then there's also language about lust. Okay? God gave them up in the lusts of their hearts, later degrading passions. And then finally in verse 27, they're consumed with passions. Lest we miss it 3 times using different words, the strong emphasis that this is an expression of lust. All right, so we need to figure out, why is lust wrong? What is lust? And in what sense are these lustful relationships that are being described? The third moral category is the category of honor and shame. Talking about the degrading, or literally the dishonoring of their bodies, both in verse 24 and again in verse 26. And again in verse 27, this whole notion of shameless acts, which is again part of this same category of honor and shame. And then along with that, this last line, which commentators have sort of puzzled over a little bit. What does it mean when it says they received in their own persons the due penalty of their error? And we'll talk about that a bit. Okay? And then finally, if that weren't enough, we also learn that these relationships are not natural, but they're contrary to nature or beyond nature or something like that. They ain't natural in one way or another. And what the heck does that mean? All right? And what I'm trying to suggest is these are 4 distinct forms of moral logic, somewhat interrelated to each other, but each one of them having their own sets of issues that if we're going to really unpack this, we need to understand all of them. So in this talk, I'm going to, and when you put them all together, you see there's a lot of evidence in this text. There's a lot of data in this text on which we can rely to tell us why Paul says what he does and why these behaviors are wrong. Paul has not left this unclear. This is not a speculative exercise. This is an exercise where we have an abundance of exegetical data that is confirmed by lots of other examples in the New Testament that allows us to understand what's really going on here. So this is not a speculative exercise. This is actually, from an exegete's point of view, a pretty rich banquet of stuff to work on. The data is all there. So, first of all, we turn to the language of purity and impurity. Paul declares in Romans 1 that because human beings failed to worship God and serve the creature rather than the Creator, God gave them up to impurity. Right? Now, the first thing to note here is that Paul fairly frequently links sexual behavior with the language of impurity. We see it, for example, in 2 Corinthians 12. Note impurity, sexual immorality, and licentiousness, a threefold pairing, all connected to sexual misbehavior. Again, in Galatians 5:19, fornication, impurity, and licentiousness, another threefold set, clearly all referring to sexual misbehavior. And then in 1 Thessalonians 4, a discussion about abstaining from fornication, controlling your own body, and then the summary, God did not call us to impurity, which is presumably what all of that was, but rather to holiness. And then finally, one more in Colossians, fornication, impurity, passion, evil desire, another sequence of clearly sexually oriented misbehaviors in which impurity is included in the list. So clearly, Paul uses impurity to speak broadly about sexual misbehavior. There's plenty of exegetical data to confirm that. What's puzzling, however, is how to relate Paul's language about impurity to the larger biblical context, where we see in the New Testament a fairly radical revision of the purity laws of the Old Testament. Right? Jesus takes a loose standard to these Levitical standards of purity. He touches lepers. He allows a menstruating woman to touch him. He eats with tax collectors and sinners. He even dies in a form of death that Paul tells us is explicitly cursed by God in the Old Testament. Okay? Note how in this text it's freedom from the law that's specifically related to the inclusion of the Gentiles, right? Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law, having become a curse for us because the law curses anyone who is crucified, and that's what brings the gospel to the Gentiles. So these purity laws in the Old Testament have been, in some ways, significantly revised. And as I mentioned before, we see that in Peter's vision, right, where he sees the blanket drop down from heaven with the unclean animals on it, and the response from heaven is, "What God has made clean, you must not call profane." In other words, what we see in the New Testament is a fairly radical redefining of what constitutes clean and unclean, which is almost identical to the language of purity and impurity. Okay? What do we do with that? And if that weren't enough of a confusion, we have another word from Paul, not only from Paul, but also from Romans from Paul, where he says, "I know and I am persuaded in the Lord Jesus that nothing is unclean in itself, but it is unclean for anyone who thinks it is unclean." Okay? So that raises the pressing question, how are we to relate this quote in Romans 14:14 to the quote that we just saw in Romans 1? Why is something simply a matter of what you think in Romans 14, but it seems a fairly objective and sweeping statement in Romans 1? Right, that's the characteristic sort of puzzle. Now, as you know from my book, my suggestion is that we solve this problem when we note that there is this movement in the New Testament as a whole away from defining purity and impurity externally by external behaviors and defining it more internally in terms of the motives and dispositions of the heart and the will. And I think that's what we see in Romans 14, for example, right? It's not the behavior that's wrong, it's how is this expressive of who you are as a person that becomes problematic. We see this, for example, in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, where inner hatred is equated with murder, and secret lust is equated with adultery. Okay? We see it also in Mark 7, where it says it's what comes out of a person that defiles, for it's from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions arise. I mean, the New Testament is pretty explicit about this stuff. Interesting that Jesus criticizes the scribes and Pharisees who are like whitewashed tombs, right? They look fine on the outside, but they're filled internally with corruption, right? So again, we see this movement from purity as an external attribute to purity as an internal attribute. And I would suggest to you that that concern with an inward disposition is also reflected in Paul's use of the language of impurity for sexual behavior in particular. As we have noted before, Paul regularly links the language of sexual impurity with references to lust, we saw those two in the list together, and also references to licentiousness or lack of self-restraint. All right? So we get lust, impurity, and licentiousness all in sequence as a description of what sexual misbehavior is all about. In other words, the very nature of Paul's lists and the things that he combines it with suggests that what he's really getting at here is an internal disposition, the lack of self-control, the lack of restraint, a kind of indulgent activity that knows no proper boundaries, okay? And that's what makes it impure. And that's entirely consistent with what we see in the teaching of Jesus and everything else that we've talked about it. So what we see, I'm arguing, is this movement away from externals to the heart and the will. And from that perspective, what Paul is describing here is behavior that arises from a heart that knows no boundaries, right? And is simply driven by self-centered lust and passion. That's what makes it impure, right? Because that's the way the New Testament as a whole treats this issue of impurity. Now that leads to the second form of logic, which is actually should be a separate bolded area in your notes, but I didn't do it quite right. And that is the language of lust and passion. And in order for us to make any sense of this at all, we have to understand how people in the ancient world looked at passion and at emotion in general, which is not the same way that we do today. In the ancient world, to experience passion is to be passive, to be under the control of something that is outside of yourself, right? So if you're passionate, by definition, you're not in control. You're not, the reason and will is not dominating your action. Something else is. Now, that's not the way we think about it today. The way we think about it today is when you are experiencing strong emotion, that's when you are most truly yourself, right? But that's completely different from the way people in the ancient world thought about passion. And if we don't catch that, we're missing something really important. And as we've already talked about to some extent, Jewish writers saw this link between excessive passion or lust and same-sex behavior. And I'll just cover these really quickly because we've seen them already. Here's Philo, talks about the land of the Sodomites, a part of the land of Canaan, afterwards called Palestinian Syria, was brimful of innumerable iniquities, particularly such as arise from gluttony and lewdness, and multiplied and enlarged every other possible pleasure, with so formidable a menace that it had at last been condemned by the judge of all. The inhabitants owed this extreme license to the never-failing lavishness of their sources of wealth. For deep-soiled and well-watered as it was, the land had every year a prolific harvest of all manner of fruits, and the chief beginning of evils, as one has aptly said, is goods in excess. So it's this excessive desire out of control, that results in this. We see similarly, another quote in Dio Chrysostom, the man who is insatiate in such things. Insatiate, of course, means incapable of being satisfied, right? Never-ending desire. The man whose appetite is insatiate in such things, where he finds there is no scarcity, no resistance in this field, will have contempt for the easy conquest and scorn for a woman's love as a thing too readily given, in fact, too utterly feminine, and will turn his assault against the male quarters, etc., etc., okay? So again here, this notion of same-sex as expressive of desire, not content with the usual forms of satisfaction, driven to the increasing exotic, okay? Now, that suggestion that same-sex behavior is linked to this insatiability of desire is part of what in my book leads me to wonder about the link with Gaius Caligula. You remember what I said about him there. This is a guy who would rape women in a side room and then come back to the banquet and comment on their performance, who liked sort of threesomes with a woman below and a woman above, like male-male sex as well as male-female sex, ended up getting murdered by being stabbed in the genitals, as Suetonius tells us, which interesting sort of resonance with receiving in their own persons the due reward for their penalty, right? So whether or not Caligula is being explicitly referred to here, I find it hard to imagine that Paul's Roman readers would not at least think of Caligula as at least one example of the kind of thing that Paul is talking about here. And he certainly was exhibit A of the kind of language that Paul reflects here, okay? Now, All of that, of course, raises profound questions regarding whether this boundless, excessive passion of someone like Gaius Caligula can be meaningfully compared to ordinary gay and lesbian Christians who want to live their lives together in long-term committed relationships and, have to hash out who's going to cook dinner and, what sort of furniture are we going to get for the living room. I mean, this is a whole order of magnitude difference that we're talking about here. It's also worth noting, just in passing, there are some people who have critiqued my book saying, no, lust is not excessive desire here, it's really misdirected desire. But remember that this text not only talks about lust, it also talks about being consumed with passion. So the notion of excessive desire is simply inseparable from this. This is not simply misdirected desire. This is desire that is consumed with passion. That's what the text itself says. And so you can't just say, well, it's lustful because it's misdirected. No, it's misdirected because it's lustful. That's the biblical, that's the ancient assumption about the nature of lust itself. Okay, so to summarize all of this, so far, I'm going to go a little further, but this behavior is impure, arising from a distorted heart and will. It's regarded as driven essentially by out-of-control lust and passion, as we see in Gaius Caligula. And there are certainly some aspects of that picture that don't seem to apply directly to contemporary, committed, long-term gay and lesbian relationships. Now, I want to just briefly cover not only impurity, but rather the whole notion of honor and shame, right? That these are degrading or shameless acts. And let me just do a little bit of more technical stuff here. I want to introduce you to some common categories that are used in more academic treatments about honor-shame in general. And these have to do with the way sociologists and anthropologists talk about honor-shame cultures, because this is a category for a particular kind of culture. All cultures, to some extent, have dynamics of honor and shame, but most scholars think that the world of Paul is properly characterized as an honor-shame culture. And the modern equivalents are many Asian cultures are honor-shame culture. Interestingly, in the U.S., the closest we get to it is gang culture. In urban settings is to some extent an honor-shame culture as well. So these are the characteristics of honor-shame cultures in particular. One of these that in honor-shame cultures, sensitivity to the dynamics of honor and shame is one of the central defining values. I mean, honor and shame is always there. In some cultures, it really comes close to the center of things. Honor represents a particular claim to worth or value, along with the social acknowledgement of that worth or value. It's worth noting that in Greek, the word for honor is the same word that's used for money. Okay? So, in this sort of culture, honor is social capital, right? It's what allows you to get things done. And if you don't have it, you can't get things done. Okay? Moreover, honor in these cultures is a limited good. That is, if you gain in honor, you take it from somebody else who loses in honor. All right? There's always winners and losers. If there's a winner, there has to be a loser. And honor is exchanged in public interactions that are called challenge and riposte. Right? In other words, there's some sort of challenge to your honor, and the way you respond to that, your riposte, determines whether you win and you get more honor, or the other person wins, the other person gets more honor, and you're shamed. All right? So all these public interactions. So, when the scribes and Pharisees say it's not lawful for your disciples to be messing with food on the Sabbath, this is a challenge. All right, and if Jesus doesn't have a good answer, he's shamed and his challengers are honored. If he has a good answer, he's honored and his attackers are shamed. Okay? All right. What's critical in all of this, however, is that who decides who wins? And the ones who decide who win are the observers, what sociologists call the public court of reputation. Honor depends radically on what other people think about you. You have honor if people honor you. You have shame if people don't honor you, right? That's it. There ain't nothing deeper than that. And as I said, all cultures have this, but some cultures, it's more fundamental, and most people think that the world of the Bible was one of those honor-shame cultures. Now, I want to talk a little bit then about gender in honor-shame cultures in particular, because it's a big deal. Public competition for honor happens almost exclusively among males, who, in terms of honor, in terms of gender, males embody honor. All right? In the same way, females are thought to embody shame. Now, shame here is not understood as a negative quality. Rather, it's the sensitivity to what other people think and the willingness to adapt your behavior or your demeanor to publicly accepted norms. Okay? So honor and shame and male and female line up in a really big way. Okay? So the honor of females in particular is bound up with the honor of the males to whom they are connected, who is responsible for them. Okay? It's usually the patriarchal head of the household in which wives and daughters reside. So, for example, we see in Sirach, a sensible daughter obtains a husband of her own, but one who acts shamefully is a grief to her father. An impudent daughter disgraces father and husband. In other words, inappropriate behavior of the female shames the males, the father and the husband, and is despised by both. All right? So you see here the dynamics of honor and shame. Now we see this linkage of female and male honor in a word that's often ignored in Romans 1, the reference to their women. Right? These are not just women, it's their women, who are shaming the heads of the households because of their behavior, not just shaming themselves. Okay? And as I mentioned before, in the first 300 years of the church's life, this was not lesbian sex. This was just any sort of sexual impropriety beyond the normally expected sexual behavior. But the most important thing to understand about honor and shame in Romans 1 is the way in which shame is specifically associated with failure to act in accordance with your gender. Right? If you don't act in a manly way if you're a man, that's degrading. And if you don't act in a womanly way if you're a woman, that's degrading. So we see, for example, in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 14, does not nature itself teach you, here's another word from Romans 1, that if a man wears long hair, it is degrading, or literally, it is dishonorable to him. But if a woman has long hair, it is her glory. Now, here we see the same juxtaposition of the language of honor, shame, and nature that we saw in Romans 1. But it's also important to note this close linking between the blurring of gender distinctions and the loss of honor in the world where the Bible was written. For a man to wear long hair is considered inherently degrading, but for a woman to wear long hair, it's her glory. To present yourself in a way that conforms to gender expectations is honorable, that violates those expectations is shaming. Now, that, I would suggest, confirms the moral logic implicit in the honor-shame language of Romans 1. All right? This is in addition to being lustful and impure, it's also degrading or shameless for a particular reason. That is, that this behavior violates established social expectations of the time regarding gender and regarding behaviors that are seen as appropriate to male and female. For females, that dishonor arose from any sort of sexual behavior outside of marriage, as well as the failure to maintain the appropriate passive or submissive role in marriage. For males, dishonor or shame was more particular a result of failure to act like a man, which included, among other things, playing the passive role in sexual intercourse. Now, it's also worth noting in this regard, the end of verse 27 there, receiving in their own person the due reward for their error. It's probable to see this in this light, referring to the inherent dishonor that comes from playing the passive role in sex, or perhaps an allusion to Gaius Caligula's murder. Could be either one of those. A lot of contemporary expositors will say, well, this is the AIDS virus, But the problem is that would be utterly inscrutable to Paul's first readers, right? It wouldn't make any sense to them. And I think the starting point of interpretation is what would make sense to the first competent readers. And you have to find something along those lines.
Was there sexually transmitted diseases just around at that time?
No, if there were, nobody made the connection between sex and those diseases. There's really no data that suggests that this is any kind of awareness at all.
Can I ask another clarified?
Yeah.
Women that use their bodies in ways outside of sex, was that just regular coitus? Was during their periods, anal, oral, was that misusing their bodies here?
It could be. I mean, that's one line of interpretation. Another line of interpretation says it's lesbian sexuality. Actually, the line of interpretation that I think makes the most sense is to think about Caligula with these troicas, or just committing adultery with women and then commenting on it. That all of that would have just been horrifying to Jews or Christians. Well, not just to Jews or Christians, to anybody with any sort of civilized capacity at all. That's one of the reasons why the Caligula argument seems to make some sense to me. So one final point before we move on to the discussion of nature, about honor and shame in particular. All of the discussion about honor and shame takes place without any reference to the revealed will of God at all. Cases of honor and shame are regarded in this text and in almost all biblical texts as completely self-evident, not in need of any argument from Scripture. You don't need revelation to tell you what's honorable or shameful. You learn that every day of your life in lessons great and small. But it's particularly the case that categories of honor, shame themselves are subject to some review in the New Testament. 1 Corinthians 1, God chose what is foolish to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. Or Hebrews 12, looking to Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, who for the sake of the joy that was set before him endured the cross, disregarding its shame, and has taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of God. So shame and honor have a kind of relative value, but they also come under critique and don't have a sort of absolute value. So they're useful when they're obvious, but that doesn't mean they're always true. That's it for now. Time to go to your groups.